Clive Stafford Smith is with us, co-founder of Reprieve, as we talk from here to across the pond. Can you hear me?
You know, Paul, what this is all about proving is what you've known all along, that England's 200 years behind you, but today we're only 2 hours behind you. Sorry about
There
that.
you go. There you go. First of all, I wish we had a lot more time on this one, because there are a lot of people, Clive, who do not know the story of Tasha Shelby's case. They just don't know it. And I don't have a lot of time to go over this and set the groundwork. But in a thumbnail sketch, could you kind of lay the groundwork for that?
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, she was accused of shaking her small child to death under the old shaken baby syndrome theory. And she was charged with the death penalty because, you know, any parent is meant to protect their child, and naturally people get very angry at parents who don't do that. Unfortunately, the whole scientific, and I use that word loosely, theory behind shaken baby syndrome is something that was just made up by a British guy, actually, in 1997. And an awful lot of parents have suffered a great deal by losing their children or losing their liberty and sometimes losing their lives because of this theory. And that happened to Tasha. She was convicted. The state sought the death penalty, but thankfully didn't get it. And he's served now over 20 years in prison for something. I'm sure, Paul, you've got kids. I've got a child. The idea of your child dying in some great tragedy and then you being falsely accused of it and sentenced to prison is just past my imagination. It really is.
We understand she's been a model prisoner there, as many people have told us about that. The other part of that is the state's trial expert, a medical examiner, Dr. Leroy Riddick, was compelled to retract his testimony supporting Ms. Shelby's homicide conviction because that testimony had been discredited by new medical knowledge since the time of the trial. So the doctor that gave evidence that led the jury to convict her later on said, "Wait a minute, I was wrong." And
it's more even than that, Paul, because Leroy Riddick was an old friend of mine. I've known him for 30 years, and a lovely gentleman mobile. And when this case first came up, over 20 years ago, Leroy called me about it, and I said, "Leroy, you got to be kidding me! This shaken baby syndrome is total nonsense. You can't buy into it." And he said, "Well, yeah, that's what we're taught. That's what we're taught." And anyway, we argued over it, and he wouldn't believe me. So he testified against Tasha. But one thing I've got to give, there are an awful lot of people who make mistakes who won't put their hand up and admit they made mistakes. Leroy continued to read the literature. I deluged him with stuff because it was one of my obsessions. And sadly, he died a couple of years back. But before he died, he put his hand up and said, "Look, I made a mistake. I was wrong. The science has moved on. What I thought was true was not true, and I've got to, in all honesty, say I made a mistake."
All right. But here's what and I said it earlier, what am I missing here? Because that would seem to be enough normally to get a new trial, or at least some inquiries and some people opening up an investigation on the state part, not the nonprofit and advocacy groups like you and several others. That combined with the fact that how the child died, according to her, was he fell off a bunk bed, hit his head. And they are saying, no, he couldn't have done that from where the bunk bed was. But my understanding also in this element that was never presented, and correct me if I'm wrong here, was the fact that she had a doctor's appointment to look into some behavior that he had, and apparently was having seizures. So seizures, fell off the bunk bed, etc. That was the reason. And how does that all play it in here? And what am I missing here? Why would the authorities not take a look at that and said, well, at least let's consider a new trial?
Paul, I'm going to flatter you here by saying you're a journalist and you're therefore willing to reconsider things. There are two people who are not willing to consider anything, and that's doctors and lawyers. I'm afraid my profession is catatonically unable to look at itself and say, look, we made a mistake. And the medical profession is very much the same, in large part because of my profession, because we go around suing them every time they made a mistake. And I think it's really sad. I'm not proud of that part of it. So here we have a situation where we've made a ghastly mistake. This poor woman has lost 20 years of her life in addition to her child. And now no one will admit they made a mistake. In the legal system, there's a case called Pereira versus Collins out of the US Supreme Court 30 years ago, where the US Supreme Court said, and this is, sorry, you've just got to listen to this. I'm not going to explain why it's rational, because it's not. The Supreme Court said there's nothing in the US Constitution that says thou shalt not execute or imprison an innocent person. Therefore, there is no constitutional right not to be imprisoned or even executed merely because you're innocent. Now, to me, that's just totally mad, but it is the law of our land, I'm afraid.
It does run contrary to a lot of other things. What's the status right now for filing any new briefs and the probability that they'll be successful?
It's very, very hard because the real issue here is that Tasha is innocent. But the courts will only listen to whether she's, should be set free if we prove that her trial was constitutionally unfair. And it's apparently not unfair if it reaches the wrong conclusion. The courts have said you can have a perfectly fair trial where an innocent person is convicted. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me. So, yeah, I filed an amicus brief on behalf of another person in Mississippi who I represented some years back. Her name was Sabrina Butler, and she was accused of killing her child. And, this was back in the day before Google, and I spent a week in the Tulane Medical Library in New Orleans trying to find something else that would explain what the doctors saw. And I did find something called chronic nephrotic syndrome. And look, I'm not a doctor. I didn't know what I was talking about, but I cross-examined the doctors about it. They had to admit they couldn't rule it out. And on her retrial, having been originally sentenced to death, she was exonerated. Incredibly, she had another child. She had this very romantic thing where she married her jailer, and they had another child. And her second child, they looked for chronic nephrotic syndrome just in case. And it turned out the little girl had it. So they were able to save her life because of this random thing that we were able to find what really caused the first child's death.
Was there anything that such as the appointments or the doctor's appointments that showed she cared about her child? Were there any other things out there that were not permitted in the original trial that should have been permitted, and maybe something could be based on that?
Well, it's very hard to say because the lawyers at the time did what they could, but at the time the medical world thought that shaken baby syndrome was a real syndrome. And so, you can't really fault the lawyers. They all became lawyers because they couldn't get into medical school, and presumably. So you can't really fault them for not understanding that the whole medical profession was wrong on this. Now, here we are years later, and there's new evidence that shows that the medical profession was just wrong, but that's evidence of innocence. It's not evidence that the original trial was somehow tainted by the prosecutors lying or whatever. So this is our problem.
We have a quick break here, but I want to ask you when we come back, because you guys don't take a lot of cases, and the cases that you take have to be pretty special, where you really believe that they are innocent. I want to ask your thoughts on it, and we'll do that in the final. My guest, Clive Stafford Smith, co-founder of Reprieve. We're talking about Tasha Shelby. Here's a story. This was in February this year. Earlier this month, a federal judge ruled to keep Tasha Shelby behind bars despite the former medical examiner changing his ruling on the child's cause of death from a homicide to an accident in 2018. What was the ruling? Why was that ruling from the federal judge not to even permit a new trial?
Well, it had been through the state courts, and the trouble was when it got to federal court, what I was saying earlier, that the federal judge had to find a constitutional violation. And so the federal judge, and I've had federal judges say this to me, it's all very interesting, this evidence of innocence, but doesn't mean the trial's unconstitutional. And that's the problem. I mean, it's very, very hard to win those cases in federal court.
Clive, how does this case kind of compare to some of the other ones? Because we've been doing this now. You've been doing this for a while, and she's been in prison for, 22 years? So it's got to be aggravating that at least you don't get more attention on it.
Well, it is, and I'm very grateful to you for giving it attention, Paul. I hate representing or helping to represent innocent people because it's such a tragedy. And you were saying that, people like myself are very careful on this. Yes, we are. And the people involved with Tasha just wouldn't be doing it if they weren't so totally convinced she was innocent. I had a couple of my British students come out to Mississippi and spend their summer down there in Biloxi and Gulfport, going around with their British accents, talking to all of the witnesses to try to help her out. And still here we are.
All right. So, but you believe sincerely that Tasha is innocent?
I do. I think part of the problem in the world is that we as people have forgotten what my mum used to say, which is there are acts of God. There are things that happen which are great tragedies, and we always want to blame someone, and actually sometimes it's just an accident, and that's what's happened here. And in real terms, it may well be that the only solution is a pardon from the governor. And let's hope we can get some compassion there.
Well, so far as state leaders and everybody else, has been a lot of silence on this one. And I say that at the same time where we've had a couple of people have been paroled by the parole board that drew outrage across most of the state because both of them were double murderers, and they're back on the streets. And at least it lends the thought that some consideration or should be to at least bring this case back up and take a look at it. But there's been silence. Clive, thank you, man. I appreciate it very, very much. It's always it's a pleasure. And if you're back in the States, we'd love to have you in studio.
Oh, I'd love to be there. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You got it. Thank you, man. Clive